Nice to see so many people here. I appreciate that. And this is also a nice opportunity for me to report on an ongoing research project in Iceland that might be of interest for linguists working on variation and change in general, and also for people that are curious about descriptive features of Icelandic phonology and certain aspects of the socio-linguistic situation in Iceland. So the overall research project is called Regional Pronunciation, Attitudes and Real-Time Change, or REPARC as we call it. And it's funded by the Icelandic Research Center from 2023 to 2025. And here you can see the project's team, including our excellent graduate students and undergraduate students that have been collecting, transcribing and analyzing the data. So this is a really good research team. And here you can see an overview of the talk. So I'm going to start with some background, tell you a little bit about some previous research on this topic. I'm going to describe the aims of both the overall project and also this talk. I'm going to describe the methods and data that we are collecting and analyzing. And then I'm going to present some selected results from the phonological part and also from the attitudinal part. And after that I will conclude. And I assume that this might take maybe 45 or 50 minutes or something like that, the talk itself, and then of course we can have discussions, and you can also stop me and ask questions if there is something that you want to ask about during the talk. So I will be presenting results from, or selected results from the first data collection phase of our research project, which is in a way a continuation of three major overview studies. And these are first Björn Guðfinnsson's pioneering study in the 1940s, some 80 years ago. And in his study, 12 to 13-year-olds from most of the Icelandic school districts of the time were tested for their pronunciation. And he tested about 6,500 children in Iceland in the 1940s, which is quite remarkable. And this study was then followed up by a project called Research on Phonological Variation in Modern Icelandic, or Rannsókn á íslensku nútímamáli, and the abbreviation that I'm going to use is RIN, R-I with a dot N. And this was in the 1980s, 40 years after Guðfinnsson's study. And this replicated Guðfinnsson's initial study, but also included older speakers, not only children, but also different age groups. Some of who had actually been tested in Guðfinnsson's earlier study. And finally, based on these two previous studies, Þráinsson and fellows carried out a third study around 2012 called Linguistic Change in Real Time in the Phonology and Syntax of Icelandic. And this is abbreviated RAUN, R-A-U-N. Málbreytingar í rauntíma í íslensku hljóðkerfi og setningagerð is the Icelandic name of it. And this project provided further insights into the fate of the regional features. And the table on this slide, I hope you can see this, shows where the participants in the third overview study came from. So for instance, some of the children in Guðfinnsson's study participated in the 50s and 60s in RIN, and then again in their 80s in RAUN. And as you will learn about today, we are still meeting the same people that participated in the original Guðfinnsson study 80 years later. So they're in their 90s, the people. We managed to interview 23 people from the original study, and we think this is quite remarkable. And of course, we have learned a lot from the previous studies. For instance, that regional variables appear to develop in different ways. It has also been observed that moving between areas appears to affect individual developments of the variables, meaning that the regional variables are more likely to be maintained by those who stay put in their home area than those who move away. This is maybe not very surprising in general, but this has been confirmed in previous studies. But we don't have very much research or information on the relationship between attitudes and the phonological developments. And we don't have any, or before this project, we didn't have any overarching data from speakers born after around 1975. So we are collecting a lot of new information about the younger generations. So we thought that there would be conditions for a thorough real-time study once more. So we had Guðfinnsson in the 40s, Rheen in the 80s, and now again a big project in the 2020s. Again 40 years later, but this Raun project in 2012 was only, they were only testing people that had been previously tested, so they were not collecting new participants. So here you can see the aims of the overall project. So we want to investigate how individuals change their pronunciation through the lifespan, and we want to map the current status of the regional pronunciation in Iceland in such a way that the results can be used for a systematic comparison to those of the three major previous studies. And then we want to explore the extent to which conscious and subconscious language attitudes play a role in explaining such real-time changes using the uniquely documented development that I was just describing. And fourth, we want to integrate attitudinal factors into models of phonological change. Regarding the first two aims there, I should mention that I cannot tell you very much about individual changes. That's something that we are studying right now. But our data offers an opportunity to do a panel study, which means that we can monitor the development of individual speakers, which is of course very exciting. But it also makes it possible to do a trend study, which means that we can monitor the development of certain groups of speakers. So for instance, in the 1980s, and again now in the 2020s, we can compare adolescents in different times. So, and I will present some results of this latter type in the talk. Regarding the aims number 3 and 4, I can say that until our research project, we didn't have much information about the role of attitudes in the developments, but I will give you a general idea of what people think about the different regional variants and their own pronunciation as well. But at this point, we haven't studied yet the results regarding the possible impact of such ideas on the actual developments. So that's also something that we are going to look further into later. Yeah. And here you can see a brief description of the main regional variables that we are investigating in this project. So in the north and northeast of Iceland, there are mainly two variants, regional variants, that we are looking into. First of them is so-called post-aspiration or harðmæli, hard speech, of the stops P, T, and K after long vowels. So this appears in words like tapa, líka, bíta, with a post-aspirated P, K, and T. Tapa, líka, bíta. As opposed to the usual lack of such aspiration. So most people would say tapa, líka, bíta. In the north they say tapa, líka, bíta. Maybe not a huge difference, but this suffices to hear where, if somebody is from the north, you usually can detect this. Another variant in the north is so-called voiced pronunciation, or raddaður framburður, with voiced sonorants before an aspirated stop. So in words like hempa, mennta, hjálpa, you get this voiced sonorant before a post-aspirated stop. But the usual pronunciation is mennta, hjálpa, and hempa. So with a D-voiced sonorant, which is actually quite unusual in languages in general. But this is the general pronunciation in Iceland. And supposedly the voiced variants are older in the language. So this de-voicing is a process that came later, probably. And then there are also two main variables or variants in the south and southeast of Iceland. So first of them is so-called HV pronunciation in words like hvalur, whale, with a voiceless velarfricative in initial position, where most speakers would pronounce hvalur with a stop. Hvalur, hvalur. This is one of them in the southeast, and the other one is so-called monophthongal pronunciation, or skaftfellskur einhljóðaframburður, in words like bogi and magi, as opposed to bogi and magi, where you have diphthongs. And apparently it's harder for people to detect this. So it's not as easy to tell if people are from the south or southeast based on this. So we will learn more about that today. And finally, I'm not going to discuss this variant today, but I just want to mention it because in the Westfjords there is one pretty well-known variant called, which is also monophthongal pronunciation, vestfiskur einhljóðaframburður, in words like banki, as opposed to the general banki with a diphthong. But I'm not going to include this here today. Regarding the methods and data in the overall project, we are collecting the data in two main phases. The first consisted of an online survey administered by the Social Science Research Institute at the University of Iceland. So a sample of 3,000 potential informants were sent the survey online and asked for the participation in order to get an overview of the current status of the regional pronunciation variation. And this includes the extent to which particular variants have been passed on to and maintained by new generations, and also people's attitudes towards them. And in order to reaching this goal, the sample was divided into 3 equal parts. The first consisted of 1,000 randomly chosen teenagers, or from 12 to 20 years old. The second of 1,000 participants that took part in the previous studies, so Rín, Raun, and BG, the original study. And the third consisted of 1,000 people randomly selected from the National Register. And the response rate was about 32%, which means 960 responses. And apparently it's a little bit lower maybe than in usual, but this particular research was quite time consuming. So people are supposed to sit down, listen to recordings, record themselves, answer questionnaires. So this was quite a task basically to do. So maybe it's not surprising when you think of it in that way. So all participants were asked to take part in a pronunciation test designed to determine the extent of their use of the relevant variables, both the previously established ones and also we are also looking for possible new variants in the Icelandic pronunciation. We are not only focusing on the regional variants. And following this listening session, the participants were asked a series of questions about their awareness of and attitude towards the pronunciation variants in the speech sample they listened to. So they would listen to 2 different texts that were read by people who had the regional pronunciation. And they would answer whether they regarded the language used by the reader as good or bad, and likable, and all sorts of questions that I will present later on in the talk. And now the data from the second main phase has been collected, and the transcriptions and analysis are ongoing now. So I will give you some insights into the interviews with the oldest participants, the informants that were originally tested in the 1940s. So they were now not only tested for their pronunciation, but also asked about their attitudes. And that's totally new in this research project. All right, so here you see a map of Iceland, and the central dialect areas in the West Fjords, in the north, and in the south. And in the remaining areas in dark blue on this map, we generally didn't expect any strong regional features. So we call this the neutral area, which is of course not maybe necessarily right, but at least for our purposes, it's we are focusing on the 3 regional or 3 areas in the West Fjords, Northern Iceland and Southern Iceland. And as I mentioned, for the pronunciation tests, all participants were asked to record themselves reading aloud a text containing target words for certain phonological variants. So in the north, for instance, there were a lot of examples of post-aspirated or potential post-aspirated stops and voiced sonorants and things like that. And the texts were the same, basically the same as were used in Rín some 40 years ago, with some minor changes, because in some cases the vocabulary was a little bit maybe old-fashioned or something like that, but it's essentially the same texts, so it's directly comparable. And then the recordings are analyzed by researchers and research assistants trained in phonetic analysis. So they would listen to the recordings, and for each target word they would give a score of 1 if the variant appears, and if it is not present, and 2 if it's present. And all the recordings have been analyzed at least once now, but a full analysis is where a recording has been analyzed by 2 different people. This is the same method as they used in Rín in the 80s. So we want each recording to be reviewed by 2 researchers. And then, on top of the areas that I showed you just before on the map, each region is divided into counties. And due to low numbers of participants in some counties, the results of the neighboring counties were combined. This is a detail that maybe doesn't matter that much for us here, but I will show you in a moment the results in different counties. So let's then consider the use of the northern and southern variables. On this slide, I hope you can see it, you can see the status of the northern variants, hard speech and voice pronunciation on the one hand, and the southern variants, HV pronunciation and monophthongal in the Rín project 40 years ago. And please ignore the green part on the on the lower left. The northern voice pronunciation and the southern HV pronunciation showed very clear correlation with age, in the sense that the younger age groups were less likely to use the variants in question than the older generation. While the northern hard speech and the southern monophthongal pronunciation had relatively equal distribution with respect to age. But the overall use of the 4 regional variants had declined from Guðfinnsson's study in the 1940s, already back in the 80s, to a varying degree, with the hard speech being the least endangered one. And if we assume that all the regional variants in question are losing ground, and based on the developments reported on in previous research, we had certain expectations regarding the youngest age group in the current project. And here you can see our hypothesis. So we predicted that the northern voice pronunciation is sporadic or non-existent among the youngest generation, since this was already quite low in some 40 years ago. And we also predicted or hypothesized that the southern HV pronunciation is sporadic or non-existent. Regarding the hard speech, we predicted that it would still be relatively widespread in the north. And we thought that the southern monophthongal pronunciation would still be existent maybe, but not very common among the younger generation. And we will see how this came out. Can you see this? It's a lot of numbers. I'll try to go carefully through this. So before going through the results, I'm going to point out some key points. So first, keep in mind that each participant was given an average percentage grade according to their usage of the variants. So 0 means no use, and 100% means fully consistent use of the relevant variant. So all target words would be pronounced with that variant. And on the slides, all numbers above 33% are in red for the sake of clarity. But it should also be kept in mind that for some age groups there are very few participants, and sometimes there are gaps in the second youngest age group. So it turned out to be the most difficult group to access, the people between 21 and 40. I guess the career people. So the numbers are much lower there. The district names in the north go from west to east, and we expect higher numbers as we travel east, based on our on previous research. And you can see that the voice pronunciation only reaches 33% or more in the 2 oldest age groups in Eyjafjarðarsýsla and the oldest group in Þingeyjarsýslur in the northeast. But it gets a higher overall score in Þingeyjarsýslur, yeah, and hard speech thrives much better. Average scores of around 50% appear in the core areas, but the lowest numbers are outside that area. So, yeah, I should have mentioned that HS is hard speech and VP voice pronunciation. And for the voice pronunciation, the numbers are generally very low. It's only here in the Eyjafjarðarsýslur and Þingeyjarsýslur where you get some numbers above 33%. And if we look further into the hard speech, so it seems to have a fairly solid status, especially in Eyjafjarðarsýsla and Þingeyjarsýsla, where it can be seen as a majority pronunciation among participants aged 46 and over. But the youngest participants in the same counties use hard speech in about a third of the possible cases. And this does not indicate that the hard speech is very strong among this group, but it also does not necessarily indicate that it's on the way out in the nearest future. But as before, hard speech is strongest in the older age groups, and the oldest group of 70 plus participants in Eyjafjarðarsýsla is undoubtedly on the top. So here, quite high numbers for heartbeats here. This was the heartbeats, and now the voice pronunciation. It seems quite weak at the current level, but only groups over 70 in Eyjafjarðarsýsla and Þingeyjarsýslur score higher than 50%. And the youngest and second youngest groups are less than 10% in the same counties. Even in the core areas of this pronunciation, it's under 10%. So we can say that voice pronunciation has become a minority pronunciation even in the north. I might actually mention here, just for the fun, that it turned out that one speaker in the north, a 15-year-old, I think, he had a very high score for the voice pronunciation, but he was basically the only adolescent that we found that still has this. So it's not, yeah, there are some people that still have it, young people. And then if we look at the southern region, so the results from the districts are shown from the west to the east again, and we also expect higher scores as we get further east here. And it turns out that the HV pronunciation is preserved among the oldest age groups in all districts, but there are almost no signs of it among the youngest speakers. So this means that the variant in question is probably disappearing, even in these core areas of HV pronunciation. But surprisingly, maybe, the monophthongal pronunciation exists in Vestmannaeyjar and Skaftfellskur, and it's still relatively evenly distributed with respect to age groups. I said just before that we might expect that this has decreased among the younger speakers, but apparently it's still relatively even. It's not very much of it in the areas, but the younger people actually still have it. So that's interesting, and maybe gives some people hope in the areas that this is not disappearing. And as you mentioned, of course, we are just doing this research. We are not hoping anything really. We just want to get the picture and see what's going on. And if we consider the monophthongal pronunciation further, we see that in the Skaftafell counties, all age groups except the second youngest are surprisingly equal, and the lowest group is the group of the oldest, actually, surprisingly. But there's not much difference between age groups. And the second youngest age group has an average of 51%, which must be considered somewhat surprising. And then the HV pronunciation is on the decline, even more than the monophthongal pronunciation, where the youngest groups are all below 10%. Also in Skaftfellskur, where HV pronunciation has had the strongest status. So let's finally, in this part of the talk, look quickly at the numbers for the youngest age group, with a comparison with the same age group in Rín 40 years ago. So in Eyjafjarðarsýsla and Þingeyjarsýsla, the numbers for heartbeats have dropped from 80 and 19% down to 35 and 40% among adolescents. And the numbers for voice pronunciation have dropped from 35 and 40% down to 8 and 3%. So this is quite dramatic, we can say. Yeah, this is also the, let me see, yeah, basically the same. Yeah, and in the southern region, we see that in Skaftafellskur, the numbers for monophthongal pronunciation have dropped from 55 down to 36. while the numbers for HV pronunciation have dropped from 30 down to 6%. So there's a clear difference between the two variants here. So concluding for this part of the talk, we can say that both northern voicing and southern HV pronunciation are rare or seem to have disappeared almost completely among the younger generation. Monophthongal pronunciation, especially hard speech, appear to be still fairly common in the southern and northern core areas. Both are declining, but not as quickly as the other variants. And the older age groups generally show considerably stronger signs of regional pronunciation, with the exception of monophthongal pronunciation in the south. That seems to be relatively even between age groups. This is maybe the most surprising result so far. So turning then to the second main part of the talk, the attitudes. In this part of the study, we are using a combination of methods from attitude research and folk linguistics. And the aims are first to investigate conscious and subconscious attitudes, as I mentioned before, towards regional variation, and to explore what role language attitudes play in linguistic change, but also to uncover underlying language ideologies by investigating non-experts' perceptions of and beliefs about linguistic matters, and then to expose how linguistic facts are linked to geographical ones in the popular mind, quoting Preston in 2010. And my colleague Finnur Friðriksson and Stephanie Bate, colleagues Finnur and Stephanie, they have background in this part of the study, sociolinguistics, more than me, I should mention that. So here the data is from the 960 participants who solved the reading task and the listening task and answered the questions online. But we also have the data from the oldest participants from the original BG study, who are now, as I mentioned, 91 to 95 years old. But they were, we interviewed them in person, so we didn't do that online. Here you can see the origin or residence of the participants. The bigger the dot, the higher the number. So here we have actually all 983 participants, including the BG people. And in the table on the left, we see an overview of the distribution of participants according to speech area and age, both concerning the 960 participants from the online questionnaire, as well as the 23 other participants. And on the right, when looking at the age groups, as I mentioned, we found relatively few participants among the group of 21 to 45 years old. So we just have to live with that. So here, the 160 is very obvious that much fewer participants there. So in the online questionnaire, we can categorize the questions as we do here. So first, there's a question about the salience of the variants. So the question was, what part of the country do you think the reader is from? And then we have questions regarding attitudes towards speakers' own pronunciation, and also about linguistic awareness and actually linguistic upbringing. And there we had questions like, or statements like, my pronunciation is common, and people would react on that. My pronunciation is beautiful. It's an important part of my identity. I noticed people's pronunciation when I was younger, just to elucidate how people are aware of pronunciation of others. And also, do you remember being commented on your pronunciation? You asked about that. And then regarding the reader, we would ask or state the reader is clear, and people will say to what extent they would agree to that statement. The reader is attractive, and the reader is normal. And we had many other questions, but I'm just going to show you the results for this here. So the first question in this category aimed at investigating the salience of the regional variants by asking where they thought the reader listener to was from. And here we see the numbers of participants who chose a distinct region after having answered that they believe to know where the reader is from. So they were first asked, do you know where he is from? And then, where do we think he is from? When looking at the reader showing northern features, 94% of participants correctly identified him as stemming from the north of Iceland. But the numbers are far from being as straightforward concerning the southern reader. Although almost half of the participants place him correctly in southern Iceland. So it's not as easy to detect this, as I mentioned before. And if we look at this by participants' age, we see that there's a 10% difference in placement security between the youngest and oldest age group regarding the northern reader, but a 32% difference from the same age groups concerning the southern reader. In other words, the older participants are more likely to recognize the regional variants and identify them correctly. Maybe this is not surprising because we are including very young participants from 12-year age. So, but still, we have this information here. And if we turn to the participants' attitudes towards their own pronunciation, and the statement, my pronunciation is common. So here we are actually concentrating on answers from participants from the northern Iceland, southern Iceland, and the neutral area. And we can see that the majority of participants agreed or strongly agreed with this statement, but in slightly different ratios. So those from the north of Iceland agreed the least, 73%, followed by the southern Icelanders, 77%, but the participants from the neutral area agreed the most with this statement that their pronunciation was common. Again, this is maybe not very surprising, but still it's good to have this information. If we look at the statement, my pronunciation is an important part of my identity, we see that more than 2/3 of northern Icelanders agree or strongly agree, 68%. The same in the neutral area, it's 60% and 58% in the southern Iceland. So the northern speakers are a little bit higher here. It's more important apparently for their self-identity. Regarding awareness, linguistic awareness, the statement, I noticed people's pronunciation when I was younger. We see that roughly 4 out of 5 northern Icelanders recall having consciously thought about people's pronunciation. And regarding participants from the other two regions, 72% of participants from the neutral area remember to have thought about people's pronunciation. There's more about this here. Do you remember being commented on your pronunciation? So they're asked if they remember that others, such as friends and colleagues, commented on their pronunciation. And we can see that more than 2/3 of the northerners have received such comments, whereas only roughly 1/3 of those residing in the neutral area and 45 in the southern Iceland have gotten remarks on their pronunciation. So these outcomes are indicative of a higher awareness towards northerners' pronunciation. And this is all new. We didn't we maybe suspected that this was the situation, but we didn't really have the data before. And finally, there are 3 questions regarding attitudes towards the reader that the people were listening to. So we are here looking at the reader from the north and then the reader from the south. And the participants were asked to what extent they agreed to the statement that the reader in question was skýr or clear, since there are some ideas about northerners being clearer than speakers from other parts of the country. This is actually well known in Iceland. And we see that agreement is very high concerning both speakers actually, so they're considered as clear readers. But there appears to be a slight difference in evaluations of clarity in the way that proportionally more participants, or 90%, agree concerning the northern speaker and 84% regarding the southern speaker, and this is not nuts. We can say that the numbers are not as straightforward as we expected, but this actually might need further attention because this particular speaker, he both had hard speech and the voiced pronunciation. And it could be that hard speech is considered as clear and beautiful even, but the voice pronunciation somehow old-fashioned or not as attractive. And we are actually already, we have collected data where we have separated the 2 variants. So in the second phase of the project, people would listen to a speaker only with hard speech, and then another speaker, actually the same reader, who would read with hard speech and voice pronunciation. And then we can say, we can separate the 2 variants regarding the attitudes. Anyway, this I think is the last or second last slide about this regarding the reader's attractiveness. So just over 1/3 of participants agreed to the statement for the northern reader that he is attractive, but 1/4 or 25% of participants agree concerning the southern reader. And maybe based on previous research and maybe the general ideas, we expected maybe more difference here. But again, this might be related to what I just mentioned, the difference between the voice pronunciation and hard speech. And now for the last statement, the reader is normal, or eðlilegur. We see that proportionally more participants disagree with this statement regarding the northern reader than regarding the southern reader. So it could imply that participants show higher awareness of the northern pronunciation feature, which would be consistent with other findings. So let's finally then briefly look at the speakers in the oldest age group who were interviewed in person. In 2023, and this part of the presentation is based on Ása Bergný Tómasdóttir's MA thesis that was written under the supervision of Dr. Stephanie Bate, who specializes in folk linguistics beliefs and is also in our team. So as I mentioned, this is the 3rd or 4th time these speakers participate in a pronunciation research project over the course of their lives. So we have unique longitudinal data on their speech, actually, and now data also on their attitudes, as I mentioned. And we used semi-structures, so we collected semi-structured in-depth interviews that provided detailed information on the participants' background, as well as insights into their attitudes, perception, and awareness of both their own and others' ways of speaking. And Tómasdóttir used thematic analysis for her thesis, or MA thesis. And it turns out that in the interviews, participants' evaluations of pronunciation were primarily based on perceived beauty and especially clarity. So those were reoccurring themes in the interviews. So for many of them, there seems to be a strong association between northern speech, particularly hard speech, and clarity. And this idea is not limited to speakers from northern Iceland. Just to remind you, the hard speech is saying bátur as opposed to bátur, for instance. For some reason, this is supposed to be or regarded as clearer for many people, the post-aspirated variant. While it is difficult to determine when or how the idea originated, it appears to have gained traction from the mid-20th century and onwards. So this idea about hard speech being clearer somehow. But the interviews also reveal some interesting ideas about the northerners. So the comments like, he reads very clearly, and I think the stresses were good. I could believe that he could very well be from Skagafjörður or Húnavísla in the north. Well, yes, I thought that he had a much clearer pronunciation than, and sometimes here in the capital region. The stresses were better and so on. And another one says, well, what indicates that he is from the north is that he speaks clearly and decisively and articulates the words well. Yes, so that's northern speech. He spoke clearly. Comments like that, but it's maybe funny that the reader was actually not from the north. So people were just, reporting on their ideas about the northern speakers. This one was from the Westfjords, so he didn't have hard speech or voice pronunciation. But they would just assume, for some reason, that he was from there, and they would provide arguments like that. He is so clear and all that. But I should mention that then in the second phase of the research project, we have the same reader. It's the same person who reads with different accents. So, of course, one feature here is that people can be reacting to different voices or whatever, we don't know. So now we are using just one reader who has been trained in pretending to be from different areas. But of course, that's also a little bit tricky, that it's an actor who is he's actually from the north, so that's very natural for him. But we trained him in reading the texts with the other variant, with advice from people from that area. So that was quite well prepared, I hope. But this is from the first phase when we had different readers. Anyway, so this just reveals the ideas about the northern speakers. Further comments on the pronunciation. So quite a few interviewees recalled receiving comments on the pronunciation. And the northern speakers had mostly received neutral or positive comments on the speech in other parts of the country. So for instance, one of them said they just pointed out that I was a bit different from what they were used to, but there was no criticism of it as such. But some speakers with the majority accent who would maybe move to the north or something would report on this experience like this. I just remember that I was mocked because I had soft speech, not the hard speech. Then I tried to change myself a bit. So this speaker had the majority pronunciation. He was, for some reason I don't remember, located in the north for a period of time, and he would try to change his pronunciation and say bátur instead of bátur, things like that. And I actually remember similar things. I grew up in the north, and I remember when kids came from Reykjavík, the capital area, to my village, we would point out that their pronunciation was a bit too soft or whatever. So I know exactly what this one is referring to. Yeah. Regarding self-identity, so speakers with the minority accents generally seem to have given more thought to their pronunciation than others. And this northern participant with a very strong regional accent did not want northern speech characteristics to fade, neither in himself nor in others. So he says, I just speak the way that feels most natural to me, but under this constant barrage of different pronunciation, it might gradually happen that you stop doing it. But I prefer speaking my dialect, so using my regional accent. And the same participant actually recounted how he had scolded another northerner for supposedly having lost his accent. So he had very strong opinions, this one. And he says even, I'm proud of my pronunciation. Yeah, and he was from the north. So just to conclude this part, the speech of the northern Icelanders appears to be more salient than that of speakers from other parts of the country. Northern Icelanders seem to attach more significance to the way of speaking as part of their own identity. And at the same time, Northern Icelanders deem their own way of speaking to divert more from the way others speak, thus highlighting the special status of Northern speech. And as I mentioned, although results on the attractiveness of the speaker did not confirm outcomes of earlier studies, the forthcoming analysis of 160 in-depth interviews could provide cues on differences between attitudes towards hard speech and voiced pronunciation. And finally, regarding folk beliefs toward regional pronunciation, among the 23 oldest participants, perceived clarity is a prominent aspect in speakers' identification and evaluation of different varieties, and it's frequently associated with northern speech. That's very obvious in the interviews. The northern speakers generally received neutral or positive comments on the pronunciation and did not try to change it, while some speakers with a majority accent faced negative comments in Northern Iceland and attempted to adopt the northern regional pronunciation. And finally, speakers who used minority regional variants reflected more on their pronunciation compared to others, with some taking pride in it. So this is a forthcoming paper about this topic, and this is our website. So I think I'm finished then with my presentation. Thank you.